Okay. Well, hello everybody. It's lovely to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation. While we're sorting out some of the technical things, I can tell you a little bit about myself. I think the computer's shutting down, so that's going to take a little while. I work in the UK at Keele University. I began my career as a musician. I decided to not pursue that, and I got interested in research. And my first area of research interest was about children and how children come to listen and engage with music. Do I need to start this again? Okay. This was all working perfectly before you came. My PhD research, which I began back in 1994, was about children's listening skills and what it is about music training that actually affects and might shape those. Since then, I've moved on to work in many different areas related to music education, development and learning. And also, I'm much more interested nowadays in the lifelong perspective on learning and thinking about learning not just in school years, but what happens after children leave school, go out into the wide world, maybe pursue a professional career, but more interested in those who don't pursue a professional career, like myself, and who continue to be very interested and engaged in music, in going to music and in making music across the lifespan. So I'm going to talk to you today about 5 different things, if I get time, if I get the presentation going. And one of them, the first one is about why music makes us feel good. The second thing is some research on children's attitudes towards music at school. The third thing is about the classical music issue and style preferences and what's going on with that. The fourth thing will be a little bit of a research project that I've been working on with a professional orchestra and some schools in England. And then finally, thinking about how we can support and encourage music making in children in a way that's going to lead them into future involvement and engagement. And for those of you who don't work in music, I think what I'm going to talk about has a lot of relevance. I'm going to give you a framework at the beginning, which will allow us to think about how people engage with things that make them feel good, particularly useful from an aesthetic point of view. And while I'm talking about the music-related parts of this, you can be thinking about how that might apply to your areas of interest and occupation. And then I'll conclude at the end with some material about how it works for music and some suggestions for how we might go on. Okay, so hopefully, fingers crossed, we can now have some support, so that might help you follow what I'm talking about.
It's a thing we always put the first speaker through.
Thank you. I have no idea what you said at the beginning either, so this might be a joke, maybe this is going on television or something. How not to give a presentation. Okay. Fingers crossed. Good. Okay, I've got lots of lovely pictures, so it's quite a large presentation. That's maybe why it's a little complicated. I'll move this away. It's just open. It feels worse for me than for you. I'm sure you're fine. I just... I've given you my overview, so here are my 5 things that I'm going to try to talk through in the time I have left. Why does music make us feel good? What do children think about it? What about classical music? Let's look at some research, and then how do we get children interested in live music events, particular interest for the audience today. So looking at it from theory, looking at it from pedagogic point of view, also looking at some practical issues around engaging children and young people. So why we like listening to music, first of all, it activates the same parts of the brain as other things that induce euphoria. So food, you've all just had a nice lunch, so you're all already feeling good. Sex, hopefully not, maybe this morning, but who knows. Drugs and abuse, I hope not, but certainly we've heard some music, and so it's put us in a good frame of mind. The bits of the brain that are responding to those things are working in that kind of way, but music also activates the motor cortex, so it makes us want to move. And the wonderful interactive performance that we had from category, we sat still, but we didn't need to sit still, and actually we may have wanted to move around a little, and that movement is really quite important when it comes to thinking about how music makes us feel. So we have a direct, euphoric pleasure and reward system going on, and we experience emotions a lot of the time that we're listening to music, mostly happiness, nostalgia, love, calm, sadness and excitement, and you might have felt all of some of those just this morning in a short presentation. So music has the capacity to make us feel in all sorts of ways, and if we wanted to, we could get into the neuroscience. However, that's not my area of specialism, so I'm not going to. I'm going to show you a picture that says music affects the bits of the brain that are going to evoke emotions, the reward system, and there's some complex chemical reactions going on there, which we're not going to worry about today. So, what we're going to look at today is more about how people talk about music and how people explain the way music makes them feel. So, one of our participants is talking about her music collection, and she says, I couldn't live without music. It is central to my peace of mind and my ability to relax. Without it, life would be more stressful and unbearable. And this is a participant who was going through chronic pain, and she was using music as a way of modulating her pain and making herself feel better, having something to connect to that was familiar, and it really made her life bearable. Another example about the way music makes people feel, from Tasman Little, one of the participants in our research, who's given me permission to quote her and talk about some of her involvement. And she's talking about something at the end of the year of working with a group of children in the local communities. And she says, the event was a wonderful affirmation of everything that we hoped to achieve. When I walked on stage, the roar of applause from the young people with whom I had had much contact during the year was evidence, if anyone needed, that through the use of music, one could bring together whole communities. So we have this idea of what music can do in a much broader sense than just the individual. I'm going to come back to talk about this a little later on. But this is the approach that I'm taking about my research, is about people's experiences, trying to document the ways in which music means something to children and young people, and then how we can assess that and evaluate that and convince other people of the importance of what we do. Right. Okay, so I want to start with some theory, and this is a little long, but I'll try and summarise it as quickly as possible. My colleague Patrick Gisley, who works in Uppsala, has been working on theories of how music makes us feel, and this is the theory that I think could be of use to other art fields. We've certainly tried to apply it to other leisure activities like knitting, and I can talk about that much more later. But we think it works for music. Obviously it's been developed for music and it works very well. And what it explains, in essence, is the fact that music makes us feel on many different levels. So there are 8 different mechanisms that are supposed to be happening here. And each of them explains something different about the way that music makes us feel. So the first thing is the actual brain response. And we're not talking about necessarily the features of the chemical patterns in the brain. What we're talking about here is the fact that we respond to sound. So sound grabs us, it captures us, it draws us in, and then changes in sound will do similar things. So if suddenly something gets louder or quieter, it gets our attention. So this is a very primitive response, the brainstem reflex. It's something that we can't avoid having in response to music. Rhythmic entrainment is to do with getting ourselves in time with music, and we do this at many different levels. From a listener's point of view, when you're listening along, things within you are kind of synchronising with the beat of the music that you're hearing. It's why we tap our feet or maybe nod our heads while we're listening. With professional musicians, we have a much higher level of synchrony because much more precision in the way that they're engaging with rhythm and rhythmic entrainment. But we're kind of getting in synchrony with what's going on, and that's one of the ways that we're supposed to feel, and it generates emotion, this kind of happening. Evaluative conditioning is about connections between things in the music and general features of emotion. And we think of this at a general level. So, for example, in Western art music, we use trumpets to signify ceremony and celebration. So this is something that we know through experience, and then we're talking at a different level now. We're talking about things that come through our experience of a particular musical system and its conventions. Major music in Western art music signifies happy, for example. This is a convention. There's nothing about the music itself that says this, but it's a convention that we've learned. And so this explains some of the ways in which we can respond. Emotional contagion is another one, a little bit more direct, where we kind of pick up on the emotions that are either in the music or in the musician, and we share those. It's like a contagion, like passing a cold, passing the emotion around the room. If somebody starts smiling and maybe jigging about, then other people will respond in the same way. If the musician, like Katarina, has a wonderfully expressive performance, then we're going to pick up on that. We're going to feel the same things that she's trying to convey to us. Visual imagery talks about how we conjure up images while we're listening. So we may be imagining shapes, gestures, patterns, waves, things that are going on while we're listening, actually making visual things. So getting a cross-modal mapping of what's going on. In this case, we're talking about music, so the cross-modal mapping is to vision, but there are many other things that we can imagine here. Episodic memory is the darling they're playing our tune theory, and that's more to do with a specific piece of music, having a specific association with something in your life. So you have a tune that takes you back to a familiar place, to perhaps a familiar person, and this is something where the emotions are triggered, and obviously that's going to vary from person to person. So some of these things are more general, some of them are much more specific. Musical expectancy has to do with the unfolding of the musical structure, and this is where most of the research in music and emotion have been working in the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s. The work has diversified a little bit now, but that was the first thing that people were actually interested in, was how does this particular sequence of events make us feel by either fulfilling our expectations or by contradicting them or by deferring them. So this is the ways in which music can evoke emotion in a structural sense. We can think of very many parallels in other art forms here. And then finally, aesthetic judgment is supposed to be the end product of all of these things. So having had all of these experiences, we then have an aesthetic response to a piece of music or to any other kind of artwork, which is personal depending on which of these things we value. So this is quite a useful framework for trying to understand how music makes us feel and also how we might try to engage. So I want to leave these 8 things here, and I'm going to come back to them at the end, to think about exactly what we might be doing to try and pull people in at some of these different levels, and which of these might be more appealing at different stages and different levels of engagement. I'm also going to talk to you briefly about the balanced wellbeing framework from positive psychology, because this provides us with a non-musical theory, and the two theories actually fit quite nicely together. But it gives us 5 concepts that are supposed to be important for having a state of balanced well-being. The first one is that whatever it is has to make us feel good, so we have to have positive emotions around the experience. The second one is that it has to give us the potential to engage, to really absorb us, to draw us in, whether it's actually engaging in making the music in this case, or whether it's responding to music. We have to be listening actively, we have to get to a state of flow, so we have to be fully absorbed and engaged. The third one is about building relationships and connections with other people. And obviously the arts have huge potential for doing that. That's what we're here for today, is to explore more about this. But building these relationships is a really important facet for something to make us feel good. It has to connect us outside. And it also has to have an overall meaning of something bigger than ourselves. So that's where the arts obviously fit very nicely. We have to be able to engage in something that has a bigger purpose. And it may be connecting ourselves to people that we don't know. It may be connecting ourselves to a sense of spirituality or even religion. These are ways in which engaging in an activity can bring us a state of well-being. Finally, and this is a recent addition to this particular framework, there's a sense of achievement. So this kind of relates to the idea of engagement, but it actually has to do with accomplishing something. So if we can accomplish something, if we can achieve something that's hard, that's challenging, and then we have at the end of it something to look at and say, I did that, I was part of that, I engaged in that process. This sense of accomplishment is supposed to be also important. So we're supposed to have all 5 of these things in anything that we do, and this concept has been applied across the board to work, to relationships, to everyday life, and also a little bit to the arts and to music. And so I won't dwell on this, but we can relate some of the points in the previous framework into these 5 pillars of well-being. So the brainstem reflex has to do with engaging and evoking positive emotions. The imagery, the expectancy, the entrainment are all about concentrating and focusing. Entrainment and episodic memory are a little bit about making connections, so our favourite music connecting us to the favourite person. Evaluative conditioning and emotional contagion have to do with the way in which we can respond to something bigger than ourselves, the overall communication and purpose. And then the achievement might relate on to the aesthetic response. So this is a hypothetical model that I've been working with over the last couple of years. It works very well for my data, but it might also work quite nicely for the fields that you're engaged in, and I welcome the opportunity to talk about this. So I thought I'd put that out there as a starting point, which is now taking up a little bit too much time, so I'm going to start skipping a little bit quicker through this. So, first of all, second area of research, wanted to talk about what children think about music, and this is based on some work that I did over 10 years ago now, looking at children's attitudes to music in school in the UK. So we did some large-scale work with children using a survey, we interviewed teachers, we then followed up with some more extensive individual work with focus groups with some of the children. And what we generally found was that enjoyment of music at school was very high. And we were quite surprised about this because there's a very perceived problem with music at school in the UK. Look, it's not a very popular subject when it becomes optional at the age of 14. But it's compulsory before 14. And general views from other research have been that music wasn't very popular, but we found that enjoyment was relatively high. 2/3 of children enjoyed their school music lessons. And what's happening in those music lessons, if you're not familiar with the system, is that in the UK, children are engaged in a whole class. This is part of the curriculum, it's part of the timetable. For an hour a week, they'll be engaged with either with a specialist or with their class teacher in activities including singing, including composing, including listening to music, writing about music. So it's sort of general music education. They will be playing instruments, but they won't be focusing a great deal on the technical side of it. But they do also have the opportunity to learn instruments at school as part of the extracurricular activities. So a small number of children were doing that, and some of them said that they would like to, and we call these the aspiring children. The rest of the children said that they weren't interested in that, so they weren't having lessons and they didn't want to. What we found was that as children get older, there is a real decline in the engagement and involvement with interest in music. So extracurricular activities drop off very quickly. More girls than boys tend to keep being involved in music, so boys tend to drop it a little bit quicker. What we also found was that all the children listened to music outside school for extensive periods of time. So 4 or 5 hours a day was average kind of responses for listening to music outside of school. Now what we were interested in, I think that all those changes we made didn't say, never mind. Was interested in looking at what the children thought about the sense of identity. So identity was mentioned at the very beginning today. What they thought a musician was, how they became a musician, and whether they themselves could be a musician. And we're interested in thinking about the longer lifelong engagements. And we looked at our active, currently involved in music, aspiring, and those who were not interested in music, so inactive children, according to music lessons. So what we found was the descriptions of the musicians were people who plays a musical instrument. This is what children think being a musician is. So they have a very straightforward definition which has to do with the activity. If you don't play, then you're not a musician. So according to their definition, I went for 15 years. When I left university, I didn't play at all. So for that point in my life, I was not a musician, according to children's definitions. There was a sense of knowledge being involved in their definition, though. They had to know every single keyboard and every single note and every single instrument and be special. So there was a sense of really kind of knowledge was important. And working much harder. So hard work was really kind of key to their definitions. A proper person, a proper musician, it's like magic. So they go click and it's working, where we go click and it's still going and going and going. So this is the children acknowledging that there's a process involved and that they will possibly be able to become musicians in that point. They thought their teachers could be musicians, sort of. So one of the children in year 4, so that's children 8 and 9 in that point, was saying it's someone who can teach other people how to do it. That's a good definition of a musician. But then when we asked about the teachers, the moderator here is engaging in this conversation, is your teacher a musician? Sort of. And she's not, because a proper musician is properly trained and qualified, and she just plays the music. And she's really good at it, but not in the fully qualified group. So You have to be fully qualified in order to be a musician. And you don't have to be a musician to be a teacher, unfortunately, according to the children. So they don't always have a very high opinion of their teacher's musicality. You could know how to do it and you just can't do it, but you could still be a teacher. So we do have a sense that the teachers are maybe those who wanted to be performers and perhaps have not been able to achieve. The children in schools are maybe picking up on some of that. We asked them about role models and musicians, and so classical musicians, this brings us on to the second point, which is about engagements with classical musicians. The man that holds the sticks. So that's an indication of having seen a concert at some point, and that's the musician, the person who's managing the whole thing. Think of Beethoven sometimes, because my teacher plays fast on the keyboard and Beethoven goes quite fast. Then we've got lots of pop musicians, and mainly from the aspiring children, all of these are from the aspiring children. So they had role models in the classical field and also in the pop field. I suddenly thought of Elton John, my mum. So lots of different kinds of people being mentioned here. What was interesting was that the children who were not interested in having lessons or pursuing music any further didn't actually come up with any specific names. So they just talked about the man, things like the man that holds the sticks or the person in the white coat at the front. They really weren't talking about specific people, so they didn't have an aspiration of something that they held up as a role model. I said before that hard work really came into it. Anyone can be a musician if they try. You have to practice. It'll take like 3 or 4 years. Well, those of us who've gone on to do that know it takes a bit longer than that. But 3 or 4 years, or maybe 5 or 10 minutes a day, really hard. Some ideas, but the basic idea is a good one here, that they know it takes hard work, and if you put the work in, then you can achieve. You've got to have practice, you've got to have determination, you've got to have confidence. So those are the things that children see as important for achieving in music. Now, I'm going to move on a little bit to talk about different kinds of responses to music across the lifespan. I'm going to skip this one. I wanted to talk a little bit about music education approaches. So we tend to prioritise music performance in our models of education, and the children really pick up on that. They realise that you have to do it in order to be involved in this thing. We also have some ideologies about the value of listening to music, and music listening is typically taught as this kind of decoding activity. So we're learning to hear what the composer intended, and we're taking this at quite a high level. If we go back to that framework that I presented at the beginning, though, there are many ways in which we could teach children to listen that have nothing to do with that aesthetic listening, that kind of, this is what you're supposed to think and hear and experience in music. And as I say, this makes very little relationship to what children actually do with their music listening. The emotional connections that they talk about in their listening out of school are far greater than what happens in school music appreciation. And I think that's one of the challenges that the whole premise of getting children to actually go to events is got to work on, is how to bridge the gap between what's happening in school that's seen as formal, traditional education, and what's happening out of school, which is seen as something that's very personal and connected to the children and their own senses of identity. So, I'm going to skip a little bit. Just to think a minute about how we can challenge style preferences and get interested in classical music, I want to show you a little bit of research going a bit younger than school years, first of all, just to see how we can do this. So we know that we get exposure to music before we're born through repeated experience to particular sounds. At birth, the baby prefers its mother's voice, the version of its mother's voice that's recorded as it would be heard in the womb versus the one that actually it gets in the outside world. And there's no preference for a father's voice even after a few hours postnatal contact. So what that tells us is that before birth we're having auditory experiences that start to shape where we're coming from. Infants are also able to discriminate infant-directed speech compared to adult-directed speech from their own mother. So the emotional content that goes on in the mother's voice can be preferred to the mother just speaking normally to another adult. So there's an indication that this is coming from experience. And we know that music that's heard before birth can actually soothe babies a little bit after birth. So this is being used through repeated exposure, through television programmes and through deliberate listening to certain kinds of music. And I'm going to show you briefly a little bit of research I did back in 2001, where we have this little makeshift experimental booth with 2 different lights that come on and music that plays. And so we have some music that plays. So this plays for a bit, while the light's going down, the baby is looking at the music at this point. And then after a little bit, we get some other stuff coming from the other side. You're going to get them both at once, that's not how it works. So that's the basic setup is that there are two pieces of music that are very, very similar. The baby shouldn't be able to tell them any difference, but one of them is familiar to the babies in our study group. So this is one of the babies in our study group listening to a piece of music, first of all from one side which is unfamiliar. In fact, it starts with a familiar music, but it doesn't matter which way around. And while the baby looks, the music plays. Very clearly that for the first one really captured his attention. The second one, he's sort of wondering where the first one went. And there's a choice being made there. It's a definite choice about the music that he would prefer to listen to, and as long as he keeps looking, he keeps getting the one he likes. And what we found was that prenatal exposure, so each baby in this study had a different piece of music, but they were each played 3 months before birth, every day for up to half an hour. The experimental group prefers their familiar music, so there was a significant difference in the amount of time that they wanted to listen to music that they knew as opposed to music that they didn't know. And in a control group where they had no exposure to music deliberately, there was no difference at all between the same pieces of music. So I played that same piece of music to another baby who hadn't experienced neither of them, and the second baby couldn't tell the difference. But the first baby clearly did and had a preference. And I gave this in a job talk once where one of my colleagues, who was a psychologist and not a musician, said, "Why did you play the same music from both sides?" Which is a perfect demonstration of the point. If you don't know the things, they should sound basically the same. And so you shouldn't have a preference. But in this case, the babies clearly did from their experience prenatally. So what we know is that the more we experience something, the more we like it from some of the experimental aesthetics views. Going back to the 70s and 80s, mere exposure is supposed to lead us to like stuff more. And according to Berline's theory about arousal potential, we can change this through a number of different factors. Exposure is one of them, and through exposure, things become more familiar and less complex. And so we have this curve, the inverted U-shaped curve, which is used a lot in experimental research in this area, which shows us that when we first experience something, if it's moderately complex, if it's at the top of the U-shape, let's say, because we've had some experience of similar things and it doesn't sound too difficult to us, then we're probably going to like it. If it's too simple, it's going to be down at the bottom end, so we're not going to be very interested in it. And if it's too complex, it's going to be down at the far end of the curve, and so we're going to have trouble engaging with it. But through repetition, we can move ourselves back up the curve to like it more. So as we have more exposure to something, we are supposed to engage with it more. This isn't quite how things work in real life, because we don't just listen to one piece of music at a time, and because we engage with things in very many different ways. But it does give us a starting point for thinking about how does liking develop, where does it come from. So I want to show you another piece of research with a little bit older children using some of the same bits of music. Looking at children who were aged 3.5. And there were 3 pieces of music that they all heard, but some of them were the same children as the earlier project, so each of them had their special piece of music that they'd had before birth, most of which had not heard the piece of music in between because the mothers were completely sick of it after 3 months of listening. So it was unfamiliar for recent history, but it was familiar from previous experiences. And I had this little toy which I customised with the help of my technicians, so that as the children put down the keys of the toy, one of the pieces of music would play, but they had to keep holding it to keep it playing, so we could tell what they were interested in listening to. They get 4 choices this time instead of 2, because they're a bit bolder, and also because I was interested in comparing music. So is hopefully a little bit of video. youngest child was the piece of music that she'd heard prenatally. And it's interesting, I mean, she's not looking at me, but she's really engaging with. She wants to keep hearing this, unlike the other ones where she moved on quite quickly. She's looking around, and I would say she's probably looking around for Mum at this point to say, this is something we had, where's that gone? So, really interesting example of how children, of how children engage with the different music. So what we had was, in order, there was some fast pop music, there was some fast jazz, there was some slow jazz, and then there were their own pieces. And what we found was that there were differences between the fast pop and the slow jazz. But there was no difference between the fast pop and the fast jazz, or the fast and slow jazz. So essentially, they liked the pop music best, they quite liked the fast jazz music, and then the slow jazz music was the least liked out of everything. But bearing in mind, they've got to keep holding a button, and there's nothing much to do while they're listening to it, so they have to keep processing this. I did find this quite tricky to begin with, because they're on this thing is on a little table, and they're having to hold the thing down. And a lot of children wanted to get up and dance, and as soon as they got up and danced, the music stopped, and so they had this kind of conflict about, I want this, but I want to do something to it. So but we refine our research techniques as we go, but it's really interesting exposure. I'm going to skip over the rest of this bit because I want to make sure I've got time to talk about, I'll tell you about a little bit more about the second part of the study, which is where we looked at what was really being experienced in children's everyday lives with this particular sample. So we phoned them at random intervals with a mobile phone that went round with the child and said, what's music? Is there any music? What's going on? And this was the bit that showed that actually the young children were exposed to a lot of music. So they had 81% of their waking hours with music, which I think is quite extraordinary. There's a lot of music at home, there's less music in the nursery, and nobody takes a journey in a car with a 3.5-year-old without music. So 48 of our 49 car journeys had music, and the 49th one was because the radio was broken. So music is something that occupies parents and young children very nicely. They didn't have music much when they were out, because it was mostly outdoors. What I thought would be interesting here, though, is to give us an indication of the kind of music that the children are exposed to. So live music only makes up 10% of their experiences, and they tended to be quite random. So these are 3.5-year-olds. They don't experience very much live music. It was walking past a busker when they were out shopping, was one of those. Occasionally people's parents would sing, or older siblings would sing. There was one instance of going to a concert, which I think we wouldn't be that surprised at that age group. But I think it's quite telling to say that there is very little live exposure to music in this particular age group. Most of their music is children's music. The second biggest category is pop music, and then classical music comes in at third. It's relatively high compared to the rest of what's the other things that are being listened to here, but it's quite small in overall terms. Most of the children's music was chosen by them. Mothers also chose music, and siblings were involved in it. Most of the children's music comes from television, multimedia, and so on. So, as I say, very little live music. And most other people were likely to choose music for background purposes, like engaging in having a meal, having a bath, getting ready for bed. If the children were choosing the music, it would be dominant in the activity. It would be the thing that they were doing with music. So, I am going to have to start skipping a bit because I'm going to run out of time. You're going to stop me, aren't you? Was that what the gong was for?
Yeah.
Okay.
Still well inside your time.
Okay, I've still got quite a bit to go. So, what we know with adults, then, I'll summarise a little bit of this, is that, as I said, we looked at our inverted U shape, and we can see that experience is important, but music preferences do change very quickly. There's a lot of stuff about variety, and people regulate the kind of music that they listen to. So we go through periods of exposing ourselves a lot to something, and then we say, right, that's enough, I've got to put this away, I've got to come back to it, maybe in several years' time. And what we need to do from a research point of view is try and understand that, because most of the research that's looked at repeated exposure is talking about 15 or 30 times of listening to something, not extensive periods over years and years. So this is a challenge for us in order to engage with research. And what we know about preferences across the lifespan is another interesting point, because we have this kind of prejudice that classical music is for older people. And there is some research that suggests that more complex music is preferred by older people, which may have to do with the way that that inverted U goes across an entire lifespan. So when we're younger, we have less mental capacity to process complicated things. However, I actually don't think that that's particularly useful. I think what happens is that we perhaps keep extending our exposure to music as we get through the lifespan. And so these are the sorts of things that maybe appeal to us more, but I don't think there's anything intrinsic about the music. There's an interesting theory by Lamont about open-earedness. So young children are supposed to be very open-eared, and my experience in all of my research is that that is genuinely the case. I've played very complex classical and dance and pop music to 8-month-old babies, and they like it all. So there's no kind of issue about music being suitable for small children, having to be simple or having to be simplified. There is a phase where we become much less tolerant in adolescence, and this has been well researched. So adolescents tend to become much more focused on particular kinds of music. It's part of their establishing their identity and finding out who they are in the world. So this is a very important developmental phase of making a commitment to something and saying this is important. A lot of it has to do with the things that go around the music, like political beliefs or fashion or friends. But this is where we get a little bit more focused on a particular style. In young adulthood, we become more interested, and then in older age, we are also supposed to go through this decline in open-earedness. This is based on a lot of research that's given music to the participants and of cross-sectional research, and so we have to be careful about that because cross-sectional research only tells us about what today's generation of 70-year-olds are liking and not what today's 20-year-olds are going to like when they're 70. Obviously, we haven't all got the capacity to do that kind of research, but it's important to note that things may well change as generations go through, styles may become a little bit more open. And there are suggestions from education that a way to get someone into something new is to start with something familiar, and so we'll see some examples of that hopefully a little bit later on. There's a problem in classical music, so we know that a lot of people go to arts events, and I'm drawing on data from the UK here. 77% of adults have participated in the arts in 2013 to 14, but classical music audiences are rapidly ageing, mostly white, well-educated and retired. And so this is the challenge that we're facing, is how to get people into it. One of the children in our evaluation says, I really like classical music, I would really like to hear more of it, so very positive attitude there, because I haven't listened to very much, and it's really cool how they express their opinions and the title of the piece. Like there's one called Swarm of Bees, it sounds like there's a load of bees running around, I really like it. But the interesting part here, and everyone's kind of saying, no, that's the sort of thing that you hear just at concerts, and that's what old people listen to. So, classical music is what old people listen to as far as the children are generally concerned. Although, there are some people who have got engaged by this because of the projects that are out there. So, I want to talk about a music partnership project that I was involved in 2008-9, which involved a whole range of musicians engaging with schools, going into classes with young children, with older children, putting on live events, doing composition weekends, doing a whole range of playing along with the children. I'm going to focus on the live events because it's of particular relevance, I think, for today's purposes. But this partnership was working, as I say, with a range of local schools. Central government were funding this, and it was a pilot scheme, and it was one of those very frustrating arts-based projects that ran for a year, and then the funding ran out, and the whole thing folded. So having got lots of people excited about music, there was very little for them to then do afterwards. This is a common problem, certainly in the UK, in the way that things get funded. And so one of the challenges is how to make these things more sustainable and allow them to go on beyond the life of the project. So there were two aims in this project. One was to get children excited about music, and the second one was to provide some opportunities for the arts organisations involved to think about what they do and how they could do it differently. And so I say there were different kinds of activities, and I'm just going to focus on the live part. So what happened was there was a live event put on. In fact, there were about 3 or 4 events in the course of the partnership, and I'm just going to focus on one of these, where there was going to be a concert which was going to take place in the theatre in the Round, in the local area that I work in. And that was the little clip that we saw at the beginning of the presentation that came from that particular concert. So the schools were built up in terms of preparation for this by having the musicians come into school. And so this is one of the cellists from the ensemble who was playing in the school lunch room. So this is something you can see the children just going about their business, and he's just set himself up and he's just going to play. This was it's had quite an impact in very many different situations. And the children are saying, oh, I thought it would be really boring. So there's this thing, this perception of classical music as boring. But then when he played, I thought, oh my God, I want to come. So they were told that this concert was going to happen, and if they wanted to, they could go. It was free, it was all arranged for them, all they had to do was to say yes, and get their parents to say yes, and this became interesting. A lot of the parents thought that the children would find it boring, so they tried to put them off, which was really disappointing. But having had these experiences in school, the children were much more excited about actually going on to the concerts and thinking, wow, this could be really exciting. So we have the cellist again in another school, just set up in the playground. It's quite a nice school. He was playing unaccompanied bar, so he wasn't tailoring his repertoire particularly for anything that would have dumbed down to the children, if you like. And as you see, a group of children have suddenly realised this is going on and come over and said, well, hey, what's that? Ooh, that's exciting. He carries on playing, and then they get the invitation to go to the concert, and so quite a lot of them eventually do decide that this is something that they would like to do. So here is a still from the concert, which shows us it's a theatre in the round, and the children really appreciated that because they had all got a really good way of seeing what was going on, and seeing what was going on seemed to be very, very important for them. Not being able to see is a common complaint from children going to concerts, especially when you take them to a church and it's flat, like a bit like this room, and everything's happening down here and they can't see anything, and so they get very frustrated by not being able to experience the thing fully. But this was great because it provided the opportunity to do that. And we have some excited looking children from one of the schools who really were benefiting from the opportunity to go, and they were really excited about the whole experience. What these things do, I should come back to this one actually in a minute, but what these things also do is they give the opportunity for the artists to promote themselves in the local community. So here is an instance of Tasman Little, who was engaged in this project, playing to a couple of slightly enthusiastic primary school children who are probably a little bit intimidated by the camera. But they're saying, string of fans meet Tasman. They're not quite sure what to make of her, but she's very excited about it. And she worked beautifully with the children in infusing them and engaging them in the same way that Katerina did. In telling them about the music as well as playing stuff, but really kind of she was treated like a star in all the schools that she went to, and it gave the children a real insight into what being a professional was all about. So after this particular concert, we talked to the children, we tried to find out what their experiences were. Many of them had been to the actual venue before, so it wasn't a question of getting them somewhere new, but they'd been to see the pantomime, because it's a theatre, that's what happens in the theatre. So they'd never been to see a concert. Most of them had never been to a concert before, and parents were not very supportive. The explanations were great. So this was a curated concert. The musicians stood up and talked in between the movements of the pieces, gave the children some idea about what might be useful to pay attention to, but didn't focus too much on that. They also talked about the emotions around the music and the kinds of things that it might make them feel, and so on. And I say the round was great, and many of them recognised the musicians that they'd seen in school. They all said it was great, they liked the conductor, they would come again, but they didn't want to listen to this kind of music at home. So transfer only goes so far. But what it says, I think, is that the live event has something special. The live event is better. So this isn't just about getting interested in classical music, this is about the experience of going to the concert, being taken somewhere different, having that different kind of an experience. So, what can we do to support my final section? To support and encourage young people's interest and engagement. So we have a pupil here looking very excited about the cellist playing in her dining room. We want to get more of this, so what do we do to get it? Let's go back to the theory. Just to remind you then, we've got the sense of positive emotions and enjoyment. So whatever happens in these experiences has to be fun. It doesn't always have to be fun, and some of the experience of music can be wallowing and engaging in negative emotions through sad music. But certainly, we need to make these things engaging, we need to make these into positive. So they've got to be excited about it, they've got to be looking forward to it, and so on. It's also got to be engaging. So I think the preparation that was done in advance of these concerts was very helpful in giving the children some sense of what to expect, but also what to look out for, so that they could really engage in the experience. They could see, they could also listen, they knew what was coming, they knew that they had 5 minutes of something and that there was going to be a tune that was going to be repeated. They could also build some relationships, so they got to know these musicians and they loved seeing them when they came to school, and they loved recognising them when they got back into the concert hall. And the musicians themselves also talked about this later on, about how their experiences have changed, and I'll come back to that with the practicalities. The meaning, I think the children appreciated the opportunities in these projects to see that there were other schools, and sometimes in another project I did, which was similar, children got very upset when they found themselves in a big concert at the end where there were other children from other schools who'd also been part of this project. It was sort of like, well, hang on a minute, this was ours, right? Who are you? Where did you all come from? So, I mean, the idea that it's special is great, but I think the idea of connecting can often be quite important, quite challenging, but quite an important point in saying, look, there are other schools out there, and look, there's all these children who've never been to a concert before, and look at the experience that you're having here. So, bringing people together into a meaning. And the sense of accomplishment and achievement, the children got a lot of good feedback because they were very well behaved, because they were engaged in it. They'd been given something that they knew how to make sense of. They behaved well, they got lots of feedback from that. They also felt good because they tried something new and they'd quite liked it. And so it gives them confidence to go on and try more new things. So I think there are ways of looking at all of those pillars as being there. And I've just put the second part back in again, just to remind us of some of the things I started with. These are some of the things that you might want to think about in trying to develop an arts activity that would work for engaging people who are new to it, is to try and think about hitting some of these things across the bottom here. Could you provide an experience that has some elements of visual imagery or something that actually lends itself nicely to that? Or perhaps to rhythmic entrainment, to encourage your audience to actually get physically involved with something of thing. There are many different ways in which I think this framework could be useful, and I'm not going to have time to dwell on them because I want to get through the other things, but I'll happily come back to this for the rest of the event. Issues for music education. It's important, and arts education in general, it's important that these experiences are authentic. So the children at the concert in the round were there with other members of the public. The theatre was very worried about this, and they thought that the other members of the public would hate it because they've got a bunch of children in, because normally you have a schools concert which would not have any public. But they were absolutely fine, and it gave the theatre some encouragement to say, actually, this is good. And it made the children feel like they were part of something real, rather than just something that's put on for kids. So I think that the authenticity was really important. Social interaction is another key point here for musical experiences. Some of it can be negative, and so we've got to be careful as teachers how we deal with that, but some of it can also be very positive. So encouraging social interactions, and I didn't really talk about enculturation, so I won't worry about that. So there are two pedagogical concerns that I think we need to be thinking about. One is instruction, so actually giving some preparation, and a conscious, deliberate attempt to engage in an aesthetic experience. And then on the other side, and it really is the other side, is this kind of immersion of the sort of, there are no words, there is no need to explain anything, this is just stuff that happens. So there's a cellist in the lunchroom at break, that's fine, that's just, music is all around. Everyone being involved rather than it being something for the few. And music just being part of the natural environment. And I think any project has to try and do both of those things, because I think to do one at the expense of the other means that it's going to fail. A lot of the traditional music education work would go down the instruction route. Let's teach them how to listen. And the immersion route is really also important here, about just experiencing this as part of something that people do. Music is something that everybody does. So this isn't something that should always be put on a pedestal. But it's also useful to have a little bit of distance and an aesthetic response alongside it. So balancing those two things I think is absolutely critical. And that's probably one of the most important things I want to say. I'm glad I've got time to say it. So just to conclude then, a little bit about practical concern. The parents are important. So one of the organisers of the event said, we've got a whole generation of parents in their 30s who probably had a pretty rubbish music education, frankly, and the thought of turning up to an orchestral concert is beyond their wildest imagination. They just wouldn't do it. So these partnerships were put deliberately into areas where there were some socio-economic challenges, and so they're trying to work over those things and say, we need to open these things up, we need people to come, and that's parents are one of the key things. The partnerships were great, and the children really benefited from some of the preparation, but professionals need time and effort and energy to engage with those kinds of things, particularly timescales. Professional musicians are booked up years ahead of time, and so doing things when opportunities present is not always easy. And as I said at the beginning, it's about the sustainability as well. We need things to be long-term. Just a little bit about the arts organisations, if I can. Yep. Working outside the audiences traditional audiences was really transformative, and I gather that that's what some of the slides said about Katrina's work at the beginning, having had a brief conversation at the beginning of the session. It's about changing the way you work and thinking about things in a different way. And so the director of the orchestra said, it was amazing because the musicians were transformed by the way the children responded. So there's a misconception that doing things to kids is not as important, but actually the kind of commitment was even more than you would experience at one of these professional venues. They gave even more and the kids got even more out of it. So it's not what you would expect from an educational performance. This is this terminology about this is just for children, this is just for education. It has to be so much more than that in order to work, and it was in this case. So, a nice quote there. So, conclusions. Everybody has the potential to be involved in music and any other cultural experience, given the right opportunities. That's something that comes through very clearly from all the neurological data, but also all our research. There are no barriers to this. There is nobody who can't be musical or artistic. So the only thing that happens is the opportunities, the limitations that people put around themselves, and also the limitations that school and other kinds of situations can put around. It's very important, especially in the UK, but I'm sure also here, to notice that sometimes things that happen at school are the only opportunities children get. And so they do need to be quality ones, they need to be well thought through. And we can provide the opportunities to get around the barriers. So there are perceived barriers about engagement with the arts, but by giving children lots of different experiences and lots of different kinds of experiences, then we can try and open up those opportunities. And I think, considering the way music makes us feel in all these different ways, all the arts as well, can really help us in trying to plan a sort of activity, roots into music and other kinds of cultural experiences. So, that's the end of my presentation. I haven't really left time for questions, but I've done my best. So just to say, if people are interested in talking more about the research, I'm here for the entire event, so please come and talk to me or contact me in any other way you'd like. Thank you very much.